All right, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff, who is in Boulder, Colorado right now, which I think is apt for what we're about to talk about. The Denver Broncos of Colorado fame have recently put Russell Wilson on the bench in favor of Jared Stidham, a free agent signing that they had a year ago. This is in large part due to the fact that Russell Wilson has about a big money paragraph 5 salary for 2025 that becomes guaranteed in the fifth day of the league year 2024, much like Derek Carr, who was also benched for Jared Stidham before him. The Broncos are trying to get out ahead of this situation to make sure that he doesn't get injured so that they can eventually move on from him. In all likelihood, this might go down, Thomas, as one of the most lopsided trades in NFL history. But the Broncos are moving on from it. They're being swift about it. What was your take when you heard about this earlier today?
Well, of course, I think everyone was watching closely to see how things are playing out. And, what is, by the way, while I ask you, what is their percentage chance of making the playoffs before I continue to talk about this?
Yeah, so if we go to Denver's chance to make the playoffs, it went down significantly last weekend with the loss to your former team, the New England Patriots. Denver currently has a 4.6% chance to make the playoffs. So, they win. They can still win the AFC West, by the way. The 0.5% chance. Kansas City would have to lose out, and they would have to win out, and then there would need to be a little bit of help. But they're not even out of it in that division, Thomas, just because of how kind of crazy it's been, with respect to kind of the Chiefs struggling and, the AFC as a whole not necessarily being as good as before. That's, in a weird way, maybe their most direct path to the playoffs, but it requires Kansas City losing a couple games in a row.
So my mind goes to the entire organization, right? Of course, as it always will, it will go to George Paton. What does this mean for George? What does this mean for George and Sean Payton's relationship, right? And by the way, everyone knows that George and Sean are not related. They're different spellings and all that. Different spellings, right? Geez, I think they are.
Yeah, it's Peyton. You could call it Patton if you were really kind of being a little bit what do we call it, sloppy with it. Yeah. And then Peyton has a Y in it. So yeah, there are two different spellings of the last name.
But they're both, obviously very good football people. We've talked about it, but here we are. We have someone that just came in who is the czar of that organization. And then a situation, like you said, a very, very, one of the most lopsided trades, unfortunately, for George. And now I'm just really curious to see how this is all going to play out, right? I was also close to thinking about, where the D coordinator is. And I like Vance, right? How was it all playing out for him? What is Sean going to do? Who is he going to move around? Because as a head coach or the final football say person, you make moves at the end of a season like this, right? You make strong moves to send messages to your players, to the fan base, to your owners who have invested a lot in you and a lot of faith in you as Sean Payton. And you show them that you mean business, right? So it will be a very interesting next little while. But again, back to George and the GM situation, Tom Telesco gets released recently, and that was unfortunate for him. Of course, he was there for over 10 years. I think George has been with the Broncos now, I think 3, right? I think this is his third.
Yeah, 2021, 2 and 3, I believe. Before then, he was with Minnesota as a lieutenant, so to speak, for Rick Spielman.
Yeah, and so this isn't a done deal in it by any stretch of the imagination because, again, George Paton is a very good football man. It's just what's going to happen with Sean and how he wants to approach this, right? So you're benching Russell. Again, the number was $240 million, I think.
239 or so. And I'll go ahead and bring up Russell Wilson's over the cap just so that we can look at kind of the structure and why, you do have to go a little bit deeper and read into this because I think some people who were looking at this contract, Thomas, were not necessarily looking at it from the perspective of, like, when you look at a table on over the cap, and we're dealing with this at Sumer Sports with some of our tools as well. And I got to make sure that there's not an ad being played on Jason's website before we get up on that thing. So here we go. So this is the contract, for Wilson. And when you look at it, Thomas, you have basically, and by the way, when they traded for him, and maybe you can talk about this because I do think it made the situation worse. He had 2 years left on his deal. They ripped up his old deal and created this deal. Sort of, I don't necessarily know if that was necessary, Thomas, but it spread out the cap hits, as you can see here. Only a 17 million cap hit last year, only a 22 million this year. Next year it jumps up to 35. But the real reason that they're thinking about releasing him, Thomas, is the fact that this 37 million base salary. So on the left-hand column, the fourth row down, 37 million. That currently is not guaranteed, but it becomes guaranteed on the 5th day of the league year. So what the Broncos are going to try to do here is they are going to try to designate this, Thomas, a post-June 1 cut, which basically takes all the dead money, which is that 35.4 million you see on the far right. That's going to apply to this year, and then all the other dead money is going to apply to 2025. So they're basically looking to keep this thing from being 1 year of a huge hit and pass it off to 2 years. So that's essentially what they're trying to do, which makes it tough, Thomas, because as you know, you can designate a cut post June 1 whenever you want to in the offseason, but those dollars do not become available to you from the cap perspective until after June 1. So you can cut him before that 5th day, but you don't get that extra money until June 1. And so what this effectively does is mean that the Broncos almost have to sit out free agency this coming year because of that number, right? They're going to have like $50-ish million just hanging out there, not available to them until the June 1st date.
So all of that said, and by the way, go look and project where their draft slot might be if they, where they are. I don't know if they're 10, 11, or 12. I can't remember where they'd be. Check it out while I'm talking about this. Look, this is categorically what they have to do, right? I mean, you have to do this. You watch him play. You see and you hear more about how his teammates, everyone's kind of like falling by the wayside, right? They're not behind him. At least that's what we know. And you see him moving around. He doesn't move it around the way he used to. I mean, Russell Wilson was a damn good quarterback. We know that. He's on the tail end of his career, and this is the kind of move that needs to be done. You have to decide now, if you're George Paton and Sean Payton, if that stays status quo, you have to decide on the quarterbacks out there in free agency, which you might want to pull up to while we're talking about all this, and the quarterbacks that are out in the draft. We know there are probably 5 or 6 really interesting quarterbacks in the draft, but you still have to build with them, right? This is something that will be, in my mind, if Bill Belichick were ever to leave New England and he goes somewhere else, it's not always easy for a head coach who is a world-class head coach and a Hall of Famer and one of the very best to come in and win right away with a young quarterback, right? That's not easy to do. So you have to look out in the market and you have to see, can I deal with some of these free agent quarterbacks to get me through while we're working with this young quarterback that we potentially draft? That's how I would be looking at this. Okay, where are we going now? What do we have here?
Yeah, so if you look here, these are the free agent quarterbacks this season. And it's weird, right? You have some guys who I think are probably going to be priced out of the Broncos market. Somebody like Baker Mayfield, who was $4 million this past season for the Buccaneers. His deal voids. He's been pretty good this year, relatively speaking. Jameis Winston, similarly, Sam Darnold, who just got an opportunity to play the other day. Marcus Mariota has been a backup. Tyrod Taylor got a chance to play the other day. Jacoby Brissett, by the way, Thomas, is now starting in the stead of Sam Howell this week. Like, none of those guys are all that compelling. Gardner Minshew's been pretty good this year for the Colts, but again, it's another situation where there's no real starters here except for, Kirk Cousins and possibly Ryan Tannehill, but you look around the league at the utter lack of like starting caliber quarterbacks in the NFL, and you have to think that Cousins is going to get a pretty hefty deal. So they might actually have to look towards, sort of one of these guys that's maybe a little bit more middling, which I know like makes your skin crawl, Thomas, but somebody like, Josh Dobbs, Tyler Huntley, those guys are going to probably cost in the price range that they're able to, afford. And that's, if you're a Denver Broncos fan, it's going to be like, if you're a Denver Broncos fan, that's going to be kind of a crappy situation, from 1 year to kind of go with one of those bridge quarterbacks. But, you look at Tampa Bay and your friend Jason Light, right? They let Brady retire. They took all 35 million in dead hit. That's exactly what they're going to take in dead hit this year on Wilson. They go with Mayfield, who's not a perfect guy, but they're able to sort of work around him. And now that team, if they win this week, is going to win a bad NFC South. Like, there's precedent for being able to do this in sort of a middling season. It's just really hard, and it's going to make Sean Payton have to coach his ass off, I think, to make this thing work.
Yeah, I mean, none of those quarterbacks, even the top quarterback there, is one that, anyone truly, truly wants to hang their hat on. I'm not saying Kirk Cousins can't win you games, because I believe he can. And Ryan Tannehill has done, we understand they have done it. But again, when you're coming into an organization and you're selling the organization, you're keeping morale up within the building, outside the building, fan base, your owners, you hope that you have a chance to bring in a really good young gun to either grow with and to transition with. And that's what they're going to have to decide on, to your point. So you start thinking about the Josh Dobbs area, right, of that list that you're just showing, some of these other guys. You're praying to God that you get someone in the draft. Now, think about this. What makes it difficult is if you're at 10, 11, or 12, and there's the first 5 quarterbacks going in the first 8 picks or 9 picks, you're moving up. So you also have to, trade away booty for that. It just is not a settling feeling. That keeps your stomach churning the entire offseason, Eric. It's really, really, it's a tough situation to be in, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And we're just, by the way, we're dealing with record levels of listeners right now. So just making sure we tweeted that out so people could come see the show. This has been great so far. Yeah, I mean, they're gonna, right now, if the season ended today, they're gonna be picking 14th. I think that the tough part is, we saw the point spread, and this is an interesting way, Thomas, when you look at like what is the value of these quarterbacks. They were 5.5 point, 6 point favorites against the Chargers this week. They announced Stidham. It's now 3. So you see that like that gap is about 2.5, 3 points. So there is a gap between Wilson and Stidham sort of in the marketplace. They're favored to win this game. And then they play Vegas in week 18. And that could be also for a playoff spot, or the AFC West should the Chiefs lose out. And so I don't necessarily see the Broncos losing the next 2 games and making a better position. So when you think about the draft, it's going to be either a trade-up situation where they only have 6 picks going into this draft, Thomas. So that's not necessarily all that feasible either. This might be one of those situations, and maybe you can speak to this better than I can, but this might be one of those situations, Thomas, where you have Sean Payton, who's got a lot of cachet from winning a Super Bowl to being an MVP, so being a Hall of Fame caliber guy. You have 1 year where they've been competitive, right? Like this has been a good year for the Broncos, starting 1-5. Now they're 7-8. Like this is a better season than last year. This might be, for lack of a better term, a year where they bottom out a little bit because they're picking middle of the first round. They don't really have a quarterback. They're going to be eating over the next 2 years about $85-90 million in dead cap. This is a year where they might go into the season and saying, look, it might maybe like Tampa Bay, where like expectations aren't necessarily that high. Let's see what we can do here, but let's not necessarily tear the whole thing down if it's not as good. And Peyton has that security with the money he's being paid in the contract to where they can kind of do that. That's really tough for the players and Peyton, for example, who have built that roster to this point.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. And this is organizationally as well, Eric. When you come in, as Sean did this past season, and you're trying to put together your staff, you now have a chance to step back and take a deep breath and think about how you're going to load that staff up. I think you need to look very closely at what he's going to do with his staff and the moves. I'm talking about the coaching staff, right? Anytime anyone gets a job, they have these grandiose ideas of how they want to put their staff together, Eric. Normally, certain coaches aren't available. Other times, the money, can be overbearing for a coordinator or an O-line coach or whatever it may be, right? So this is another thing that Sean Payton and potentially George Payton, however that plays out, is going to have to work on. They need to get the ideal coaching staff in place. They need to know what they have as far as development. We talk about this all the time, right? They need a developing staff here too, Eric. It can't just be riding off of a whole bunch of free agents. That's not what the new ownership group want. They want to see a development team here as well. And we say that all the time. You can be a damn good football coach, but if you can't develop in today's NFL, you're not there for long. And that's not what they know they need to do. And by the way, back to the coaches, I want everyone to know there are very few coaches out there that have Sean Payton's presence and sort of stance with assistant coaches. He is not backing down and worried about them being pissed off at him, right? He is a dude that will get after those guys, and you all have to appreciate that because that doesn't happen a lot of times, right? Sometimes there are coaches out there who are always worried about how they're being perceived and always worrying about morale. Morale is great, but he's one of those guys just like Bill Belichick and Bill Parcells. I'm sure Pete Carroll in his own way, it's like you coach your position. You're a coach. You're not a scout. You're not the general manager, right? Pay attention to developing your damn players along with calling a good game and along with being right in your meeting room. That's your job as a coordinator and as an assistant coach. But you know how I feel about that. I have some great coaching friends out there, and I also have some coaching friends out there that aren't always that easy to put together the right team and put together the right players on the field. Very important to develop.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and that is also a topic that I want to bridge over to, because let's face it, Las Vegas has played, and I'm freestyling here a little bit, but I do want to talk about this with you briefly. Las Vegas went to Kansas City this week and beat the Chiefs, and they're now 7-8. They're having a much better year. They're 4-3 with Antonio Pierce as the head coach. Josh McDaniel was let go. Dave Ziegler was let go. There are questions about whether or not they should keep Antonio Pierce as the head coach, the interim, and take the interim title. Now, there are some examples of this in the past that have worked. Marty Schottenheimer back in the 80s took over Cleveland, and was a very successful coach eventually with multiple franchises, but first with Cleveland. Jason Garrett, who took over for Wade Phillips in 2010, had a successful run as that Dallas head coach. Now, most Dallas fans would tell you it wasn't that successful because they'd only won, I think, 1 or 2 playoff games, but he was pretty good. Like, as far as these examples go, he was pretty good. So there's not a ton of precedent for elevating the interim guy and for it being all that successful. I mean, I remember Kansas City, Romeo Crennel got the Chiefs. They beat a 13-0 Packers team and won out basically. And then he coached the next year and it didn't go quite as well. It happens for the exact reason you're talking about, right? Antonio Pierce, being a member of that Raiders coaching staff, did not hire probably anybody on that coaching staff. So It's working now, right? And my friend Jeff Chadia, who works at NFL Network, he was talking about being on the field, and he was saying, like, the Raiders culture right now, like, everybody's happy. Josh Jacobs is injured. He's running around, limping around, patting people on the back and all this stuff. But that culture gets altered a little bit when you have an interim guy, right, who's working with the existing staff. You give him that permanent title. I remember in Minnesota when Leslie Frazier got the permanent title, he fired a few of Childress's guys. He brought in like Mike Singletary, Bill Musgrave, a bunch of guys who he wanted. And all of a sudden, that end of season swing that you had when you got rid of the coach that maybe no one was jiving with or whatever, but then you start getting rid of coaches that people like for your own guys, and that can upset the very culture that you're buying into this guy for in the first place. And so I think that there's an interesting thing, right? Like, if let's say you were a team president, Thomas, and you're going in, or a GM, and you're going in and you're going to interview an interim head coach and for that job, isn't that the first thing you ask is to say, look, you've gotten this team to play for you. How do you continue that while still building this staff in your image? Like, that's a hard question, right?
It's a hard question. And it's probably, a head coach will look at that thinking, all right, I've always talked to my guys around the league of who I would hire when I get a head job. That's kind of obligatory at times too. And no one wants to admit that. But if you have 5 guys that you've been breaking bread with and more for many, many years in this league, and you're talking about hiring them, So then you start thinking about that. Are you doing what is best for the organization? Right now, is what's best for the organization the staff that they have in place, but they're not really your loyalists, or you're developing that? That's something that is not that easy to make a decision on. And how many times, like you said, these earlier, I mean, there are coaches in there that he doesn't really know, and they're not his guys, and yet he's got to look out there and think, okay, I want these other 5 guys, which again don't always come available. Rarely are you getting exactly what you want on your staff. You're kind of piecemealing, right? That's how it has always been. And then next year he'll end up more than likely firing 2 or 3 guys. That's just what happens. Rarely is that first year in are you keeping your entire staff into the second year. So there's a lot of thinking to be done here, which we might as well stay on this topic here. So then you have him and you have Champ Bailey, right? Champ Bailey, as an assistant GM, who's the interim GM, is getting lauded left, right, and center. I think even Mark Davis has been pretty outspoken about it. He's got a really good chance to stay there, and that group has a chance to stay there as interims taking over, so that Mark doesn't have to look back and look at Rich Bisaccia and think, "Wow, I made a mistake." That maybe he does this time and sees how it all plays out. But Champ Bailey is worth talking about too, because, really, he's been around the league. He's got a good reputation around the league. He's a strong underrepresented candidate that deserves a really good chance. There's also talk in that building, interestingly enough. I don't know if you saw it. There was an article out there, and there's other talk outside of the building through Mark and indirectly through Mark Davis that is saying that he is considering hiring, that czar-like presence there, right? Meaning someone that would be, logistically and logically over top of both Champ Bailey and Antonio Pierce, right? Because those are 2 young guys. You get someone out there that has a lot of experience. I mean, who knows? That could be Rick Smith. Used to be, I'm throwing out a name. There's a number of them. There are a number of guys like that. Rick Smith, who used to be at the Texans, who has a great deal of understanding over top, who would be really good for those guys to bring them along. I think Jerry Reese as well. Guys like that, I think, would be really good in that role.
Yeah, that was kind of a similar, was Ernie Accorsi kind of in a similar role at the end there? Maybe he was a little bit more on the consulting end when he was finished with the Giants, but kind of a similar point where you have a person who has experience there. Now Kelly, the one question I have though is,
I didn't say
fired
Bailey, did I? I think
you said Bailey, but look, you're in Colorado, and so it's just we talked Broncos first. You're in Colorado. It's like we're giving you a mulligan for this. It's also the holiday season, so there may be a little bit of Trace bourbon kind of running through the bloodstream. So we're giving you a mulligan there. I'm in Minnesota, so my passive aggressive was gonna let you walk through Champ Bailey multiple times before I didn't interrupt you. So we both deserve some blame there. So Kelly, so my question on this is, my question about this is why did you fire Dave Ziegler then? It's kind of my question, right? Because it's very clear that the Raiders, Dave Ziegler didn't do that bad of a job, right? If this roster is able to go to Kansas City and beat the Chiefs, it's able to. So in some ways, I get the coaching part. I understand you need a new voice sometimes and all this, but and maybe this gives you an opportunity to stick up for one of your own, but why both then? Because why not give the GM a chance to sort of see through some of his, you've always talked about, there were times when you signed a guy and there was maybe programmatic differences between how you wanted them used and how the coaching staff, is this maybe a cautionary tale about don't fire the GM in the middle of the season when you fire the coach? Because, we maybe saw it as a one big problem in Vegas when it might have just been one small problem that people in the front office didn't have to lose their job over. What do you think?
Look, when they hired both Josh and Dave in Las Vegas, they were a package deal. They were both Patriot paradigm, 100%, right? That's what they were. And I think they came in as a package. Obviously, they left as a package. right, like you said, right, wrong, or indifferent, it probably got to a point where it got pretty dicey, because one thing I do know about a lot of the Patriot group that is together, they stay together, right? They defend.
Yeah.
I know that Dave was loyal to Josh McDaniel during all of this time, and there was probably loggerhead discussions at certain levels. I'm not creating something, but that can happen, right? So it could be just, let's move on, let's clean this up totally so there's no holdover, and I think that's probably it. And again, Champ Kelly, and by the way, Champ Bailey has always been on my mind. I hate to dig this up, just on the Georgia stuff. Every time I'm thinking about Georgia, because someone brought up Georgia in the airport on the way home, and I was thinking about Georgia. I think that's what happened. Anyway, I think
Can
in the
we
very
give the Broncos some love here, by the way? We talked about maybe one of the most lopsided trades in NFL history. Let's give the Broncos a little bit of turnabout here. They did trade Clinton Portis to Washington for Champ Bailey and a second-round pick, which is underrated in the pantheon of fleecings in the history of the NFL, because Champ Bailey was as good of a player as Portis, and then you also got a second-round pick with it, which is something else.
Leave it
Entirely.
to Eric Eager to dig up history, because Eric, just so everyone knows, will sit around and double dip when he's in the middle of some menial brainiac task that probably the average brain out there couldn't touch. And he's got a like 1982 Rams Vikings game on or something. You're really good, Eric. You're very good.
Well, it's a fun sport, and obviously it's a pleasure to be able to talk football, obviously, with you all the time. So and you remember those, of course, because you were your specialty. I always say this, and then you bristle because you've scouted everything, but you really do like to scout the defensive backs, and obviously Champ Bailey, one of the best to ever play the game, and that was always funny to me, especially because when you think back, and it has connections to right now, right? When you think about the Niners, and I know they lost the other day, but that team that traded for Champ Bailey, Brian Greasy was the quarterback, right? Brian Greasy is now the quarterback coach for Mike Shanahan's son, Kyle, in San Francisco. And they're all like, Ed McCaffrey was on that Niners team that the OC was Mike Shanahan. And now, now you have his son, Christian McCaffrey's now in the Niners. Like, there's just awesome, cool connections in the NFL. So to me, I think that's a fun thing here. So, yeah, man.
Before you go any further, because we had this topic, we're going to talk about our MVPs. So don't let us get out of here without naming our MVPs. And that was a perfect segue, because my MVP, as much as I would never think about having a running back, I just think what McCaffrey's done is just, it's been unbelievable. Every time I look, he's got some play, something he's doing. And I've been so darn impressed with it, so that's my choice.
The 49ers were an interesting case going into the week. Yeah, let's finish on that. So The 49ers going into the week, everybody sort of thought that Brock Purdy was going to be the MVP of the league because of all the statistics, right? And I think that people begrudgingly accepted that he was playing the position really well. And even though like none of them really thought he was that, like, and this is an example of the difference between like scouting and statistics, which is like a scout would look at Brock Purdy and be like, look, he's an NFL quarterback, he's fine, but like to call him the most valuable player is somewhat offensive. But the statistics were just being piled up, and he was being very effective. So everybody watching Monday night's game were pretty pumped about the fact that he threw the 4 interceptions, because now we can give the MVP to a real person who deserves it, as opposed to the guy that's running away with all statistics. And I'm not with you on McCaffrey. Like, I can appreciate McCaffrey because, I mean, he does so many things well, and he's so, like, when he runs the ball, Thomas, there's just like an element of, he gives you, like, you remember when Barry Sanders played and the strike zone was so small because he was little, and like you could never get a hit on Barry? McCaffrey's not as small, but when you watch him run, he gives the defender almost no strike zone to hit. And like, you add that to how good he is as a route runner and pass protector. He's truly a really good running back.
And a very smart running back where he's not, exposing on certain levels, to your point, right? He makes you hard to hit. He runs behind his pads properly. he uses other players properly to continue to get, extra momentum and such. Yeah, we could argue, because I didn't know if you're going to go back to your former chief. He is unbelievable. Is that where you're going?
Yeah, I think you do have to look at Hill a little bit, right? Because that offense has sputtered a little bit without him. Now, they played without him a couple weeks ago, and then they did fine. But he came back kind of injured against Dallas, was very good at 99 yards receiving. It's hard for a wide receiver, Thomas, though, right? Because they're only handling the ball anywhere from 6 to 12 times a game, which is just a small fraction, but those big plays obviously matter. To me, before I ask you who your MVP, like if you had to vote, who would it be? I'm going to give you who I think it's going to be. Because right now I would say Lamar Jackson, but I do not think Lamar Jackson wins it. And here's why. I think that Miami and Baltimore is a slugfest on Sunday where no one looks all that great. Lamar doesn't look good. Tua doesn't look good. It's a slugfest. It kind of plays down. Buffalo goes ahead and they win against New England. Week 18, Buffalo goes to Miami. They win the division. Josh Allen wins MVP. That's how I see it unfolding, because Josh has played as good as anybody this year. The problem is the Bills haven't won as many games as a normal MVP has won. The last MVP to win 11 or fewer games is, guess who, Thomas? You know this answer.
Oh, go ahead. Go with it. My head's somewhere else.
Ryan.
Okay. Yes. I'm sorry. I was thinking about
your 11-5 season. He won.
Yes.
Okay. So that's the last one. So I think it's Josh Allen. Before we go, really quickly, who would you pick?
Well, I get Josh Allen. You made a great argument for it. I guess when I look at most valuable player, I look at the most valuable player for that team who's taken the league by storm. And there's, like you said, there's a few of them. And I know it always wants to go to the quarterback situation. But so I'm going to go with your answer. I hate to say that. I am going to go there. I think both Tyreek Hill and I think Christian McCaffrey are fantastic football players. And in another situation, non-quarterback MVP winning season, obviously they're taking it and running, I think. But I'll go with Josh.
Yeah, I think that's a sound pick. And it also doesn't offend any of us because he looks like an MVP quarterback, right? Like that's all what we want anyway, is a guy that, big honking quarterback winning the MVP. And I think that there's a path for it. So awesome. I don't know if an MVP has ever had his offensive coordinator fired in that year, but that would be unprecedented. That would be an interesting one. So we got to run. Thomas has to go do Sumer CEO things. So we really appreciate you all coming. We did set a record for the most number of live listeners on the show. If you liked what you saw, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, tell everybody about the show as they come out of the New Year's, because we're going to continue to give you this great content as we go through 2024. So for Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been the Sumer Sports Show.